Return now to the idea of the movement from craftsmen to artists in the music of the Beatles, and not just the Beatles, but we can see this in other artists. We'll use the Beatles as a good example because they were a leading example from all this. The idea of a craftsman is that once you learn to do something, and you learn to do it well, you repeat that. So think about somebody who makes tables for a living, for example. They find a great way to do a dovetail joint on a table, and it works perfectly and produces the results. What do? They repeat that element of craft in every table they make after that. They found a good way of doing it. They do it that way again and again and again. That's considered an aspect of craft. They don't say, well, I've built one table that way. I couldn't possibly build another one that way. I would just be repeating myself. Well, that sounds comical, right? But if you think of what an artist does, the worst thing you can say about an artist is, he's just rewriting the same symphony over and over again, or she's just recording the same song over and over again. When you say that, you're basically saying by repeating something they've already done, they have no originality. They're not doing anything new. It's a weakness. So the idea of craftsmen where things are found, you find a good way of doing something and you repeat it over and over again. And the idea of the artist where you're constantly striving for new things and don't want to be accused of repeating yourself too much. These things are sort of opposed to each other. And what we find in the music of the Beatles and many other artists during the mid-60s is a movement from craftsmen to artist, or craftsperson, if you prefer. For the Beatles, craftsman means being songwriters in the tradition of American popular song. So if you want to check out some of the early Beatles music that really kind of does the brill building kind of thing, great examples are Please Please Me from 1963 and I Want to Hold Your Hand from 1964. These are really very typically constructed kinds of pieces. They have Beatle charm, they have Beatle emphasis and that kind of thing, but most of what they are brill building type pop songs. Already though, by A Hard Day's Night, which is the summer of 1964, the release, it was recorded a few months earlier than that, you can start to see the small signs that they're starting to push at those boundaries a bit, looking for ways to do things that are more creative, starting to the first inklings of the move toward the artist approach. By 1965, in large part through the influence of Bob Dylan, you begin to see them in songs like Help, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, both John's songs from '65, and Yesterday from Paul. You begin to see that the lyrics start to get more serious. They actually met Dylan in the fall of 1964. The reason why I point out the date is because, as we'll find out in next week's class, Bob Dylan didn't really become a big star in his own right as a singer and a performer until the summer of 1965. The albums that appear earlier than that were known within the folk community, but you really sort of had to be in the know to know about that. And the Beatles were. They admired Dylan. He spoke with John and Paul. They got together and he urged them to do more with their lyrics than just talk about I love you, she loves me, I hold your hand, she loves you, kissy kissy, and start to get into things that were more serious meant. And so the first signs we see of that really are starting to happen on Help, the album Help from 1965, as I say, Help, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, Yesterday. There's a certain type of form that popular songwriters use called the AABA form. That formal type goes way back in American popular music. It's not the only one that's used, but it's an important one that's used by a lot of American songwriters. And we're talking about people like Cole Porter, George and Ira Gershwin, Irving Berlin, I mean all kinds of the traditional Tin Pan Alley composers. If you look at the first 4 Beatles records and the singles that go with it, there are a lot of AABA forms. In fact, it's kind of the default form. You kind of count on the fingers of both hands the number of songs that don't do AABA form. I don't know, the percentage is something like 75 or 80%. They didn't just stumble onto the AABA form and just keep doing it over and over again. They knew what it was because they'd studied this music and they were replicating, and I think proud too. But what you start to see as the 60s unfold is fewer and fewer of those AABA forms. As they start to get ambitious with the lyrics, as different kind of instrumentation starts to come into the music, the form also starts to change as they get away from the brill building mentality and go towards something that is more sort of artistically inspired. And so if you get to 1965 and 1966, and 65 you get a song like Norwegian Wood, which formally is like nothing they've ever done before. Tonally, it's like nothing they've ever done before. Tells an interesting kind of story from beginning to end. The first use of the sitar, so you see instrumentation coming in. 1966, we get Eleanor Rigby, which is sort of Paul's song about existential angst and alienation and this kind of thing. For No One, a song about a broken marriage that uses a French horn, a kind of an anticipation of the piccolo trumpet he'll use in Penny Lane later in 1966, early 1967. Eleanor Rigby, by the way, uses the strings. It's kind of the continuation of what he was doing with Yesterday, but now the song and the string arrangement is a little bit edgier. And of course, Tomorrow Never Knows, at the end of the Revolver album, 1966, is filled with John Lennon reciting lyrics drawn from Timothy Leary's The Psychedelic Experience, which are in turn drawn from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and we've got tape loops going on, and it's just like nothing they've ever done before. There's a very big stylistic difference between I Want to Hold Your Hand and Tomorrow Never Knows, but they're really only separated by about 2 years, maybe a little over 2 years' time. And the distance from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Tomorrow Never Knows is the distance from Craftsmen to artists, and that's what happens in the Beatles music. They're not the only ones, though. In the 60s, what the Beatles are doing, a lot of other artists are doing. The Beach Boys are doing with surf music. We'll talk about that next week. Brian Wilson. Dylan is doing it in his music, and a lot of the groups who are imitating the Beatles are doing it as well. But they serve as an example to show us how this trajectory happens. As this starts to happen, and as artists start to think of their rock musicians started thinking themselves more as artists than as craftspersons, a new kind of aesthetic begins to develop in rock and roll. And it's what we might call authenticity in rock. What this means is this: you write your own songs which really are about who you are and what you feel or think. You play your own instruments on the records. You don't depend on studio musicians to play things. It's really you on the records. You're really writing songs about what you really think, and you're really playing them. That's considered authentic. So when we get into 1966 and 1967, and the truth comes out that the Monkees records, for example, they're not even playing on them. It's studio musicians. All of a sudden, that's considered, scandalous. It shows how inauthentic Monkees music is, how sort of cynically music business craftsperson-like it is. But just a couple years earlier, the Byrds, who are kind of one of the icons of musical authenticity, released a tune called Mr. Tambourine Man. The only guy playing on the record that's in the band is Roger McGuinn playing electric 12-string. The rest of the guys are studio guys. All the Beach Boys stuff from Pet Sounds, those are all studio musicians playing that. But you can see that that gets to a point where it gains critical mass, and then it's always the musicians themselves playing on the record. If it's not, it's inauthentic. It also means authenticity means that you at least appear to be in control of your image. You really are who you seem to be. You're not playing a role, you're not putting on a mask, you're being authentic, you're being real, and it's very important that you project that. And the last element of it, as we've been talking about with regard to the Beatles, is you strive to progress as an artist. There's no repeating, always moving forward. That's where you go. You're always trying to do something new, something different, always trying to expand. Although with the one exception that it is possible to go back to your roots, right? It's always possible to simplify and go back to your roots because that's seen as a sign of authenticity. But what you can't do is just repeat the same thing that was successful for you before again and again and again. By the time we get to the late 60s and certainly into the 1970s, almost everybody is operating at least in FM rock, almost everybody is operating according to this aesthetic of authenticity that I just outlined. But you know what? In the first half of the 60s, coming out of the 50s and up to about 1965, nobody was. It was still the old brill building idea of craftsmen. So this movement from craftsman to artist happens in the Beatles music, but it happens overall in the history of rock music. In fact, when we get to 1967, 68, and 69 and start talking about that in a couple of weeks, we'll talk about how FM rock continues this authenticity attitude, but AM rock, which is where this is about the time that AM and FM split off, AM continues to be very singles-oriented, very kind of brill-building approach, that kind of thing. And FM rock is album-oriented, artists, the aesthetic of authenticity, these kinds of things. Well, having talked about that, let's now turn to the rise of blues in the UK, or the revival of blues in the UK, and how that will lead to groups like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds.